Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
Money, trade, profits, enterprise. Without them, the machinery of the state could not have turned. And most of that money was made here, in places like Venice, Antwerp, Amsterdam, where freedom was prized and our modern world was born. The rise of the trading cities, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time, we looked at some of the political and religious factors at work in the 16th and 17th centuries, and if you remember, we even saw a graphic example of how the long experience of Roman rule 1,000 years before was still impressed upon the face of Europe in the location of Roman Catholic states. Today, I would like to suggest another basic structure which is not political, not religious, but geographic and economic. Back in 843, the three grandsons of Charlemagne signed a treaty that divided the empire between them. And the Treaty of Verdun gave one brother the west, which we now call France, and another the east, more or less Germany. But the older brother, who got the imperial crown, got a long strip of land running from the Low Countries to Italy, and because his name was Lothair, this land was named Lotharingia. Lotharingia looks terribly artificial for a state and impossible to defend. And in fact, it didn't last very long. But if you look again, you see that it reflects a geographical and economic reality. It runs from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and it includes the major economic centers and the main lines of communication between them: the Rhine, the Alpine passes, and of course Italy. And in the 20th century, it becomes the spinal cord of the European economy, so keep your eyes on it. Now, when European trade revived in the Middle Ages, that revival was anchored at the two ends of what was once Lothar's realm, the Low Countries and Italy, especially Italy, where one great business and manufacturing center was Florence, here. Between the two ends, then as now, stretched the axis of European commerce. Around the Alpine passes and along the Rhine, trading towns grew up or were reborn, like Cologne. And the rest of trade revolved around that axis. In the north, a league of German cities called the Hansa, Riga, Danzig, and this one Lübeck, mostly along the Baltic and connecting with Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia. In the center were Champagne with its fairs, where merchants from north and south could meet about halfway, Lyon between the Rhone and the Alps, and Augsburg between the Danube and the Rhine, and also close to the Alps. But the real wealth of the Middle Ages was at the gateways. Venice, on which the Mediterranean trade was focused, and Bruges, on which the Baltic and North Sea trade was focused. In the 16th century, however, Venice began to decline. She was no longer mistress of the Mediterranean because of the Turks, and she was no longer mistress of the spice trade because of the Portuguese. With the age of discovery, the Atlantic had taken over from the Mediterranean. As for Bruges, its harbor was silted up, and the shipping that normally would have gone to her shifted next door to Antwerp. The Portuguese took their spices to Antwerp, and the heavy goods from the Baltic also went there: grain, lumber, and herring, a crucial fish when there were 2 fast days a week, plus Lent. But then Antwerp declined as well, ruined by the wars of religion, and the wealth and the power that went with the wealth shifted to another North Sea port a bit up the coast, Amsterdam. Of course, this is a very schematic and superficial account of developments that took 4 centuries, roughly from 1200 to 1600. But what it helps to make clear is that all this time, and increasingly so, production, exchange, capital, wealth, credit were not at the courts of princes, but in these trading cities. Without their loans, without their other financial services, the princes couldn't operate. They especially couldn't make war, which was their chief occupation. And so, while dynastic states made war, city-states made profits. The cities also created basic instruments and institutions which were going to affect our culture considerably. For instance, 14th century Venice concentrated merchants and bankers and money changers, often the same person, not just in one town, but in one small area near the Rialto Bridge. They could transfer goods and money from one another by simple bookkeeping. Payments could be transferred without the use of cash, without waiting for a fare. Overdrafts were possible. Credit notes appeared, and so did something like a stock exchange. These meetings on the Rialto fixed commodity prices, they fixed interest rates on public and private loans, and then they fixed premiums for marine insurance. Just round the corner from the Rialto was the Calle delle Sicurtà, Insurance Street. And so in 14th century Venice, big business was already concentrated, and it worked in ways we can recognize today. All this high finance went on in the open air. In London, which was a backward, unsophisticated place, the Italians got together in Lombard Street, where the Bank of England stands today, walking in the rain when it raineth, more like peddlers than merchants, a contemporary noted. To save themselves from getting wet, traders began to build loggias, arcades, not just in Italy, but also in the north. This one is in Amsterdam. At Bruges, they built one on a square known as the Beurseplatz. So Bourse or Börse, which also means purse, is what a stock exchange is called in most European languages. The characteristic of a trading city was that it was cosmopolitan and that it was tolerant. When Amsterdam built a new town hall, the major statue on it was of Atlas lifting up the globe with all the nations of the world offering their goods to an allegorical Amsterdam. So while Protestant and Catholic fought in Europe and overseas in the 16th and 17th centuries, they still traded in Antwerp, in Amsterdam, or wherever the trading was good. Great ports were described as a Tower of Babel or a Noah's Ark. They wouldn't have been great if their population and their visitors hadn't been able to coexist and to work in peace. One thing this meant was city government strong enough to impose security and order. Streets were better patrolled in Antwerp than in Paris, and brawls were put down fast. Order was enforced by the Guard, and the Guard companies of citizen volunteers were part of the city hierarchy and also part of its sociability. It's one of these Guard companies in Amsterdam that Rembrandt captured in his painting The Night Watch. And there were many other depictions of guards and guilds which were very different from what you found in more aristocratic societies. In 17th century Amsterdam, widows and orphans were placed in orphanages and almshouses and set to spinning wool. The deserving poor got free food and fuel. The orphanage got the profit from garbage, which was collected and sold as field manure. And we're told that even the cats were organized with an office where at certain hours of the day a great number of cats are fed, which afterwards hunt among the stores for mice and rats. Still, cats and beggars weren't the first priority. Making money was, and big business had as many grand designs as nation-states did. One such design was the creation of joint stock companies to trade with the Indies, and an East India Company was set up in London in 1600, then another in Amsterdam 2 years later, and similar companies imitated them in other countries. These companies traded as single units, dividing their profits among stockholders who could buy or sell their shares in the exchange, and dividends were as high as 30% a year. Now, today we find stock exchanges, stock companies commonplace. But in those days, it all had to be invented, and it was exceptional. Equally exceptional was the first public bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, set up in 1610, a bank that attracted so many depositors, so many investors, that the Dutch could always borrow money at 2 or 3% less than any competitor, and this gave them a great advantage in business and in war. There is a story about an East India Company man talking to the Sultan of Java and suggesting that the Sultan encourage his people to trade, to become richer, to pay taxes, and so on. And the Sultan replies, "My people, unlike yours, have nothing they can call their own. Everything they have belongs to me." Now, that sort of people might produce a surplus if forced, but not much of one. But if the first priority of the cities was making money, the second was freedom. Not freedom for its own sake, but freedom to go about your business and do more or less as you please, as long as you don't trouble the public order. This miracle of tolerance was found wherever trade was dominant. In 17th century Amsterdam, the Calvinist pastors preached against prostitutes and Jews, but the city council ignored them. It tolerated Jews and dissenters as it tolerated Catholics, not because of any ideal, but because tolerance brought in trade and talent and capital. There was another aspect of the new cities that was modern, and that was their element of show. In a world where entertainment was rare and costly, the streets and markets were a show in themselves. The public buildings were something to see, and so were the monuments, and even the art collections in private houses, which you could usually visit for a tip. Visitors meant income for local inns, taverns, and tradesmen. So, on one hand, cities wanted to show off, On the other, they wanted to provide facilities that were pleasing to their citizens and attractive to outsiders. Not just public monuments, better streets, public gardens, public walks. Amsterdam impressed everyone by how neat and clean it was, partly because it allowed few horses and fewer carriages. Rome, whose major industry was pilgrims, paid a lot of attention to show, if not to cleanliness, in its great churches and splendid monuments. In the feasts and diversions, the plays, banquets, shops, and facilities catering to a population of tourists and pilgrims and priests, perhaps the most cosmopolitan population in Europe. In the refectory of the Jesuit college, you could hear 27 languages spoken. In St. Peter's Cathedral, you could make your confession in almost any language. Just as important, if you went down to the market in the Piazza Navona, when there wasn't a bullfight or a special race, you could see jugglers, tightrope walkers, performing animals, you name it, at any time. And you didn't even have to pay to watch. Rome didn't even mind Protestant tourists, even at the height of the Counter-Reformation. And this is proof that other interests can be as strong as religious interests. Reality is seldom black or white. 17th century Catholic Rome was permissive and non-conformist, and probably more open to free speech than anywhere except Amsterdam. Some popes were repressive and the Inquisition carried on, but the popular mood was broad-minded because it was in the popular interest to be broad-minded. Just because they had so much in common at one level, it's instructive to compare Rome with Amsterdam. Amsterdam turned on trade, everything was focused on that. There were no monasteries, no cathedral, no castle, no university, and the churches were rather inconspicuous. The houses didn't try to proclaim or reflect the wealth of their owners. They were built more for comfort than for show. There was none of the grandeur of Rome or the glamour of Venice. There were canals and trees along the quays, and things were orderly, so minds and capital and energies could concentrate on making money, not on spending it. Rome was quite different. The 1600s were the great age of the Baroque, a style whose name derives from the Portuguese word for irregular, which the Portuguese applied to imperfectly shaped pearls. Baroque is dramatic, grand, full of movement and emotion, perfectly suited to express the theatrical tensions of the Counter-Reformation and its desire to impress. Baroque architecture reasserts authority by gigantic productions. It dazzles. It enlists stage design to political ends. And you can see this spirit best, perhaps, in the work of Bernini or in that of Rubens in Catholic Flanders with his mythologies and allegories and acres of sumptuous flesh. They're just the opposite of the unassuming realism of a 17th century Dutch painter like Paul Potter, or the quiet lack of artifice you get in a painting by Vermeer. Incredibly luminous, yet perfectly realistic. From this, you feel certain that it isn't the grand who will inherit the earth, but the simple, or at least I like to think so. The towering figures of 17th century science were men of modest origin. Galileo was the son of a musician. Newton was the son of a yeoman farmer. And the two are linked by the fact that Newton was born in the same year that Galileo died. But they have more in common, because the junction of Newton's mathematical genius and Galileo's mechanical genius created a scientific revolution. Essentially, Galileo's telescopic observations and mathematical calculations extended the bounds of the visible universe so that he was able to justify celestial phenomena and terrestrial ones into one theory subject to the same laws, the laws of mechanics. Newton, you might say, carried Galileo's work to a logical conclusion when he worked out the law of gravity, which he named from the Roman gravitas, or weightiness, a law which explained the movement of all bodies on earth as in the heavens. Alexander Pope wrote his epitaph: "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." This age of great and bloody wars of religion, then, was also an age of light. In art, which fascinates the painters from Rembrandt and Vermeer to Georges de la Tour, but also, we have seen, in science. The telescope, which Galileo developed, was invented in Holland. So was the microscope. And it's worth remembering that scientific discovery did not depend on religion. Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who suggested that the Earth turns on its axis and also around the sun, Copernicus was a canon of his cathedral. Kepler, the German who discovered that the Earth and other planets travel around the sun in elliptical orbits, was a maverick Lutheran who nevertheless was a high servant of the Holy Roman Emperor, because the Emperor Rudolf didn't care as long as you were a good magician. Galileo, who got into trouble for supporting Copernicus' theory that the planets revolve around the sun, was for a long time a member in good standing of the church. And Galileo's problem was very serious, because he had shown the heavens to be no different from Earth. The moon was pockmarked, the sun had spots, and so on and so on. His observations shattered what had been assumed to be a basic difference between heaven and earth. If heavenly objects were not immutable and perfect, where then was the realm of God? Given the gravity of his transgression, the mere house arrest under which Galileo ended his life working to the end seems pretty mild. Even rationalism wasn't a Protestant monopoly. It was Pope Gregory XIII who, in 1582, promulgated the new improved calendar that we still use and call the Gregorian calendar. Descartes, the 17th century patron saint of rationalism, was a Catholic too. He coined the famous axiom, "I think, therefore I am," and found it more economical to conform in religion and think about other things. But he also found it more convenient to spend most of his life in Protestant Holland. So there was a difference. A great admirer of Descartes was Baruch Spinoza, who grew up in Amsterdam, the son of Jewish refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition. Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish authorities for holding heretical views. Although he made his living by grinding and polishing lenses for spectacles, telescopes, microscopes, what he really was interested in was truth. Truth about religion, which he wanted to purge of miracles and prophecies. Truth about the state, which he said had a natural and rational foundation. Both were part of the same problem. You had to drive out fear and hatred. You had to bring reason back to earth. Baruch Spinoza was 16 years old when the 30 Years' War finally ended. As a tree is judged by its fruit, said Spinoza, so men and institutions should be judged by their actions. Then leave everybody free to think for himself and judge by their works whether they are pious or not. And the same with politics. No one should be held to live as somebody else wills. No one has the right to force someone else to do what he doesn't want to do. Everyone is the natural-born protector of his own rights. So, the Dutch Republican experience had clearly colored Spinoza's philosophy, which is a hymn to tolerance, to freedom of thought, to democracy. All very subversive, and a precursor of things to come. And this is the point. Protestants were not models of tolerance, and Catholics were not models of oppression. But material and intellectual enterprise came more easily and could be pursued more comfortably in Protestant countries than in Catholic countries. And the most forward-looking, the most challenging creations of the human mind were going to come first in Holland and then from England, nations of shopkeepers. Next time, the age of absolutism. Please join us then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.